It's the 10th of February. Good morning, and it's a wonderful Monday morning. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down, says the songwriter, but it's not that kind of Monday. It's going to be a wonderful day out here in Gordons Bay. Theo's not joining me this morning, but if you've tuned in, you are on the fifth connection, and you've joined us for another exciting episode in this slice of the story in Hebrews chapter 5, going from verse number 1 to verse number 4. There's a very interesting movie that came out in 1967, and the title of that movie was The Chosen. And it was a novel, first a novel by Chaim Potok about two Jewish teenagers who became very good friends. The one is Danny Saunders, and he was part of a Hasidic family. And his father decides to not talk about anything else with him except the Talmud, because they were an ultra Orthodox family, and this caused him great pain. His friend, on the other hand, Reuven Malta, comes from a modern Orthodox family, and his father is more supportive of his decisions, and this causes the other friend, Danny, to envy him. The two boys are close, and despite their great differences, they attend the same college. But the novel discusses several major ideas. It's basically a character study of young men, two young men, as they navigate their lives, through their lives, uh, in the Jewish community in the 1940s. And both, though they were both Jewish, their understandings and their nuances of their religion are quite difficult and different. And of course, when the issue or the question of Zionism comes on to the radar, uh, there are two different points of departure and conclusions. And so the boys are forbidden to speak to each other. And there's about a 2-year window of great controversy in their lives as they tackle this issue. And at the very end, they focus then on rather their loving relationship with each other and the connection that they have during those challenging times. In chapter 5 of this story, in the next 4 lines, going from verse 1 to verse 4, the writer is going to talk about the chosen one, the one who's been chosen to deal with the human dilemma in sympathetic solidarity with the human family. So I've entitled this block of the story Chosen. And the question behind this section of the text is, how is the chosen one to deal with the dilemma of his people or the people? Because throughout the 303 verses of the 13 chapters of the story, the writer is emphasizing what stick to itiveness looks like, sticking with Jesus Messiah, what allegiance to the cross looks like for Christian Hebrews, because they were in great danger of defecting. Things had gotten real tough for them. And now they are chomping at the bit and sensing that maybe it's better to go back, as they did as a people in the Old Testament. The leeks and the onions were better than what we are wrestling with in the wilderness. And so the writer encourages them every step of the way to stick with Jesus, to stick to that which they were called to and called out of. So in the first four verses of chapter 1, Jesus is the superordinate one, the superordinate son. He's the basis for their stick-to-itiveness. And then from verse 5 to chapter 10, verse 18, Jesus is the superordinate walk because of his work and his worth. And then in the last 3 chapters, Jesus is the superordinate way. And so they could rest their case and trust him to carry them through. We are going to see in this section that our allegiance to Christ, our allegiance is to Christ, since he is the greater high priest in accordance with the priesthood of a very interesting person, Melchizedek, and living in accordance with the priesthood of Melchizedek rather than those of the Levitical priesthood is what it's all about. Our allegiance is to Christ, for he stands in solidarity with his people as the one chosen by God and provides salvation for sins. That's from verse 1 to verse 10. But we are going to zoom in on these 4 verses of chapter 5. Christ is chosen after the human order of men as a sympathetic high priest. Why a sympathetic high priest? Well, at the end of chapter 4, we are told that we can come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may receive, first of all, mercy, and secondly, find grace to help. Eureka, I find. That's the word for find in verse number 16 of chapter 4. We receive mercy and we find grace. So we can come with boldness, we can come with great confidence to the throne room of God or into the throne room. Why? Because we have a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses in every possible way. One who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. And so let's look at the 2 ideas in verse 1 of chapter 5, and then the second idea in chapter 5, verse 2 to verse 4. The first idea has to do with Jesus identifies as a man. Now, we know it is Jesus because back in chapter 4, this high priest in verse 14 is called Jesus, the Son of God. And he has journeyed through the heavens. He's the one who has passed through the heavens to the throne room, and he's seated there, and now we have access to him. He's the one who identifies as a man. And there are 2 sub-ideas here. He identifies as a man from among men. The first word in chapter 4, verse 1 is for. It's an explanatory gar. Gar. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God to offer gifts and sacrifices. So he comes from among men. In every sense of the choice, he's a man such as we. He's human such as we. He's appointed from among men and appointed to act on behalf of men. And this is mankind, both male and female. The reason one may find help from Jesus as a high priest is simply because every high priest must be taken from among men and be appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God. So he comes from among men. He's one of us. But as the end of chapter 4 says, without sin, tempted in every respect, such as we are, yet without sin. He faced the white heat of sin. Not as Oscar Wilde would say, the only thing I do with temptation is yield to it. Yield not to temptation, for yielding is sin. So he comes from among men, and his purpose in verse 1 of chapter 5 is he is taken from among men and appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. That was the function of a high priest. His job was so tenuous that they tied a rope around his ankle, so that when the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies and perchance he makes a mistake in following the ordinances for offering a sacrifice, he gets struck down dead. They could drag him out via the rope and pull him out from the Holy of Holies because he did not meet the requirements. So he's taken from among men, every high priest, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. So Jesus identifies as a man. But secondly, in verse 2 to verse 4, Jesus shows solidarity with men. That's why we can stick with him. Stick-to-itiveness is not something that is ethereal, a mist that evaporates like dew. Christ identifies as a man and he shows solidarity with men in 3 ways. Verse 2, he sympathizes. He can deal because he dealt. And in every way, he dealt with our weaknesses separate from sin because he did not have our sin disposition. He was the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Please remember, it's not the atonement that saves. The atonement is the ransom price that is paid to appease our wrath, our hostility toward God. This idea that God is a snorting villain in the heavens whose wrath needs to be appeased, and it is appeased by blood, I would say is not a biblical idea. Nobody wants to talk about that kind of wrath. How is wrath appeased? Well, it's our wrath that is appeased, our violence against heaven, our hostility toward heaven. And everyone would agree, who's a biblicist, that we are the ones who need to be reconciled to God and not vice versa. Even though heaven comes down in order to fill our souls, our wrath was appeased at Calvary. So he sympathizes with us because he can deal because he dealt with our sin. Verse 2. It says he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward since he himself is beset with weakness. His humanity was the weakness that he took on because humanity has limitations. But he can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward. Isn't that a wonderful thing that he can identify with us? He not only sympathizes with, but he shows culpability because of people's sin. The high priest is obligated to offer sacrifices for the sins of the people and, of course, for himself. But Jesus is without sin, and he can take the sin of humankind upon himself. It's not atonement that saves. Atonement appeases the wrath of God, the wrath of humankind against heaven. This violence against heaven. this betrayal, this treachery toward heaven. So it's not the atonement that saves. The atonement is the price that is paid by the death of one who is sinless. Romans 4 verse 25, we are justified by his death. But it's not his death that saves, because how can death save without a resurrection? Verse 9 of chapter 5 of Romans in turn says, we are justified by his life. His resurrection is the thing that gives us life. If it weren't for the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, we would be of all men most miserable. So it's not his death that saves, it's ultimately resurrection which saves. He stands in sympathy with humankind, verse 2. Verse 3, his culpability is what, in a sense, brings about is the offer of himself as a sacrifice to God for sin. And now the third idea, verse 4. Not only sympathy, nor just his culpability, but his humility. He's called by God in verse 4. No one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. He's called by God because no one takes the honor of a high priest to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, as the Aaronic priesthood was. But Christ stands in the order of a higher priesthood, as we are going to see in the succeeding verses, after the order of one, Melchizedek. Very sinister character. And we're going to talk quite a bit into that. And so this morning, 3 questions. Do you know what it means to sympathize and empathize with others? Do you know what it means to feel for others? Jesus was there. That's why he can sympathize with our weakness. Question number 2. How do you get to feel for others? Each one of us is different. And God, in his sovereign ways with us, will put us through the ringer, because he's teaching us how to feel for and feel with people so that we can deal gently. Can you deal gently? All of us can deal, but can we deal gently? We stand in great need in this country because of the crises which has fallen upon us politically, particularly decisions that have come down from America, and we need great wisdom to navigate, but great sympathy as we navigate, because we live with feeble men and amongst feeble men and women. And now the third question: what are the benefits of feeling for others and empathizing with them? There are great payouts, because it gives us a bridge to minister to people. We don't like people who are what we call the itchy-feely types. And yet those are the types that are in touch with human frailty and with humanity. Where are you postured this morning in terms of your sympathy index when it comes to people and how to deal with them? You're going to have opportunities on this Monday morning to deal sympathetically. You're going to be in high traffic. Some of you are right there already. And how are you dealing with your emotions, with your attitude when it comes to road rage? Well, you'll have great opportunities to exercise and show that you have what it takes to stick with Jesus, Messiah. I trust that you would have a wonderful day as you navigate through all its vicissitudes. We'll hear you back here tomorrow morning, the same time in the same place. May God bless you.